All right, Shalom Aleichem, brothers and sisters in Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, and good evening. Shalom Aleichem is a Hebrew expression that comes from the book of John. Oh yeah, Aleichem Shalom, right? Shalom Aleichem is a Hebrew expression that comes from the book of John, chapter 14, and verse 27, where Jesus says, "My peace I give you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, and neither let it be afraid." I want to thank Kathy Haywood for inviting me to teach you on this series of lessons on the miracle of Israel, past, present, and future. Before I begin, I want to share with you my DNA story. For Christmas, my daughter bought me a DNA kit through 23andMe. Well, it took 3 months to get the results back, and when it came back, I thought I'd let her look at it first. Well, she does, and she looks up at me, she says, "You're 99.9% Ashkenazi Jewish." I said, "Yeah." But I kept thinking, where's that other 0.1% coming from? It's all right, it's somewhere, right? Probably right. Ashkenazi Jews are from Central or Northern European region, so be aware of that. I told my Jewish friend in Indianapolis about it. He's a Jewish Christian. I think he's with Chosen People Ministries. And he says, "I could have saved you a lot of time and expense." He said, "Just go look at your face." It's okay. It's right. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in a Jewish home and into the Jewish community. And for the first 22 years of my life, I attended the Jewish Reformed Temple, where my picture still hangs on its wall along with my confirmation class. As a young child, I had a deep fear of dying. So I went to my rabbi, who was known all over the Midwest as a brilliant scholar, and I said, "Rabbi, what happens to us when we die?" And the rabbi responded, "Well, Tom, I think there's a little cubicle somewhere in the sky out there with our name on it." Well, that wasn't the answer I was looking for, so I went about living my selfish life. I was a senior at Ball State University, Muncie, Indiana. I went into a nightclub into Ohio, and I was looking for girls, and I was following a perfume scent. And and at the end of the trail sat my future wife, Sue, and I found out later it wasn't her perfume, but I walked up to her, I said, "What's your name?" She said, "I'm Sue Frederico." I said, "Really, are you Spanish?" She said, "No, I'm Italian." I'll say the least, I wasn't making a very good first impression, so naturally when I asked for her phone number, she said no, but her friend gave me Sue's phone number, and I called her when we got back to Fort Wayne, and we dated for maybe 7 or 8 months. When I asked her to be my wife, not for the right reason, mind you, I just didn't want her dating other men, so you can tell where that marriage was destined to end up. After 7 months of marriage, I asked Sue for a divorce. Well, I really didn't ask her for a divorce. I said, "See my brother, the attorney. You should have seen her Italian mother and my Jewish mother going at it. It was quite a sight." Sue moved back to Chicago, where she was from, and I went about living my selfish life. A few months went by, and I woke up with a feeling of dread. I realized I had made the worst mistake of my life, that I truly loved Sue. My heart was broken. I won her back. I called her in Chicago, and she said, "No, I'm not coming back." My business partner at the time was having Bible studies on the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the New Testament, called the Brit Hadassah in Hebrew, a study of eschatology or future things, and he said, "Come along." And I said, "I am Jewish, and one thing's for sure, we Jews do not believe in Jesus." But I was desperate. I was looking for answers from anywhere, so I said yes. So I remember walking in his apartment, and I saw a group of people sitting on the floor, holding hands, praying, and talking about somebody named Peter, Paul, and Mary. So I thought they were a 60s group. Anyway, after 7 months of Bible study in the book of Revelation, I came to realize Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. It's like a light bulb went off over my head, and I jumped over the couch, ran out the door, asked the Lord in my heart, made him my Lord and Savior, called Sue in Chicago, and I said, "You need to believe in Jesus." And she says, "I do." I said, "Well, maybe you don't." So I knew she had somewhat of a head knowledge of Jesus, but not a heart knowledge of him. And if everyone would do what I did to bring someone to the Lord as I did with Sue, we'd turn the whole world upside down for Jesus. I mean, I prayed, I sent her letters, I called. At the time, the books 666 by Salem Kerben and The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey were popular. I sent her the books. Sue became a born-again believer. We got remarried. We just celebrated our 44th wedding anniversary. Thank you. And the Lord has honored us with a Christ-centered marriage and a gift from heaven itself in the form of our daughter Sarah Jo, and I feel the same way about my son-in-law Drew. Both Sarah and Drew are truly living as children of the Lord. My parents were not very happy that their son had become a Gentile, but I knew that was an impossibility. My mother told me to change my name to Tom Smith, which is a Gentile name, but I said no to that. My father said something interesting at his 70th birthday party. He said, "Son, I don't agree with you being a Christian, but if you're going to be a Christian, be the best one you can be." Sadly, my father died 2 weeks later in his dental office of a massive heart attack. When I first told my parents that I believed in Jesus, they didn't talk to me for the first 2 years, and after that, the relationship was strained. But in a way, I'm very lucky because in the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox movements, many times when a child says, "Mom, Dad, I believe in Jesus," the parents will perform a ceremony called as a Shiva, known as a Shiva, sitting Shiva. So an actual funeral goes on in the parent's mind. The father will say, "You're disowned," and the mother will say, "I wish I'd never given you birth." The Jewish community considers me to be a traitor, but I now have a new community, a community of God, brothers and sisters in the Lord. Not a bad family to be in, right? I consider myself to be a completed Jew. I didn't convert to Christianity. I completed my Judaism in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. I became a child of Abraham by birth and a child of Abraham by faith, and I came to realize one very important thing. That is that Judaism, like so many other religions, that's what they are. They're religions. They're based on works. They're based on traditions. But Christianity, I'm talking now about true Christianity, not nominal Christianity, Christianity in name only, but true Christianity, as I understand it, is not a religion at all. Rather, it is a relationship between an individual and our Lord and Savior, Yeshua HaMashiach. Okay, so let me go on. The first lesson will be on the miracle of Israel from the 1948 War of Independence to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The rebirth of Israel in 1948 is a modern-day miracle. Never before in the history of the world had any nation been so utterly destroyed, its people scattered to the four corners of the earth for 2 millennia, and then regathered back to her homeland, and even revived their ancient tongue. Never before, except for Israel. It goes against all odds. In my opinion, the regathering of the Jews from the four corners of the world is a miracle greater than their deliverance from Egyptian captivity. 70 years ago, the nation of Israel was born in a day. Zion gave birth to her children, and we celebrate that birthday today. Isaiah 66:8 says, "Who has ever heard of such a thing? Who has ever seen such a thing? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children." On May 14th, 1948, God brought his people back to the land he promised Abraham. But the miracles didn't stop there. God is not finished with his chosen people. Great things are ahead for Israel, along with many trials and tribulations. Not only is this day the 70th anniversary of the birth of Israel, but this comes on the heels of the 50th year since Jerusalem's reunification and 100 years since the Balfour Declaration in November of 1917. The Balfour Declaration is the British document that recognized the right of the Jewish people to establish a homeland in the land of their forefathers. Over 1900 years since the Jews were driven out of Israel, many non-Jews have tried to move in, but they were driven out by supernatural sandstorms, hordes of locusts, crop-eating insects, malaria, and believe it or not, an almost 1900-year drought. God shut the heavens for 1900 years. Many came and many left. However, when the Jews moved back to the land opened up for the Jews. What a miracle. It just puts the hair right on my back when I say that. God has given us numerous prophecies in the Old Testament regarding the regathering of the Jewish people back to their homeland in the end times. The purpose of these lessons on the miracle of Israel is to lift up the state of Israel, and in so doing to give honor to the God who creates and protects her. Speaking of protecting Israel, if you were watching the news last Thursday night, you probably saw where the Iranian Guard, Republican Guard in Syria, shot off 20 rockets to the Golan, northern Israel. Well, the amazing thing is, and I don't know why the news hasn't really picked up that much on this, 4 rockets were intercepted by the Iron Dome. 16 rockets. This isn't just the Palestinian stuff from years ago. This is Iranian rockets. You know, guess where they landed? In Syrian territory. They never even entered Israel. Imagine that, right? Jeremiah 31, beginning at verse 35 says, "He who appoints the sun to shine by day, who decrees the moon and the stars to shine by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord Almighty is his name. Only if these decrees vanish from before my sight, declares the Lord, will Israel ever," and I'm going to repeat that word, ever, "cease to be a nation before me. Only if the heavens above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth below be searched out, will I ever reject all the descendants of Israel because of all they have done, declares the Lord." If you want to get rid of the nation of Israel, you're first going to have to get rid of the sun, moon, and stars. And by the way, no atomic bomb is ever going to drop on Israel. You know, the Bible tells us that. So where's the safest place to be, especially during the tribulation? Well, Israel. Well, not if you're Jewish during that time, the last half, but all right. After Israel's exodus from Egypt and wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, Joshua led Israel back into the promised land. God gave Joshua victory after victory, wiping out the pagans. But Joshua died, and Israel never finished conquering her enemies in the land as God had commanded. One formidable enemy was the Midianites, who were as numerous as locusts and had an army of 120,000 warriors. The Midianites were descended from Abraham and Keturah. Now, according to the book of Genesis, chapter 25, Abraham married Keturah after the death of his first wife, Sarah. Keturah bore Abraham 6 more sons and 7 grandsons, and that's probably a revelation to most of you. Most people don't even have an idea of that. It's in Genesis chapter 25. In the book of Judges, chapter 7, God raised up a judge named Gideon and promised Israel would take the Midianites in battle. Gideon only had 32,000 men to fight the 120,000 Midianites. Yet God wanted the Jews to see his might rather than to rely on their own human strength to win the battle. To be certain the Israelites understood this, God reduced Gideon's army to 300. When the dust settled, the 300 were still there. 105,000 Midianites were dead, and the remaining 15,000 were either captured or fled. God had the Midianites get confused and kill each other so that the Jews could not take credit for the battle. Today, we see a similar scene in Israel. Israel is once again returning to the promised land and is surrounded by large numbers of mostly Arab enemies, many of whom are descended from Ishmael, born from Abraham and Hagar. Now, I assume you all know the story from Genesis about that, where Abraham and Sarah are sinning against God, and God says, do not go down into Egypt. There's a drought in the land, but they did anyway. Abraham tells Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister, which is a half-truth, because she was his half-sister, but a half a lie is a full lie, I guess, right? So anyway, from all that sinning, Abraham and Sarah come back from Egypt, and they bring back a lot of treasures, and they bring back somebody that they shouldn't have brought back, which was Hagar. And Hagar, through Abraham, gives us Ishmael. Now, if you remember what the Bible says about Ishmael, that he'd be a wild donkey of a man, and every man's hand would be against him, and his hand would be against every man. Well, it was true back then, and sadly it's true today. God again wants Israel to trust his protective hand and not their military prowess. What do you think is the greatest evidence that the Bible came from God? Perhaps archaeological evidence, eyewitness accounts, literary consistency, prophetic consistency, expert scrutiny, or changed lives? The answer is none of the above. The greatest evidence that the Bible came from God is the existence of the Jewish people. God promised he would preserve and prosper the Jews, and he has. Over 300 years ago, a Christian philosopher by the name of Blaise Pascal was asked by the King of France to give him proof of the existence of God. Pascal answered, "Why the Jews, Your Majesty, the Jews?" My lesson for today is about the modern state of Israel and the miracles, the literal miracles God has done from its conception on May 14th, 1948 to its preservation at this present time. And I want you to know that I'm going to be speaking from a bias, so please interpret all my thoughts in that light. I submit to you that bias is a good word and prejudice is a bad word. Prejudice is to prejudge, and bias comes from an honest evaluation of the facts as they really exist. Pastor-teacher John MacArthur once said, "If you get Israel right, you get your eschatology right." Eschatology is a fancy word for things that come last. And it goes without saying, if you don't get Israel right, then your eschatology is confused. You're not going to have a proper understanding for what lies ahead. Getting Israel right means understanding what God has done and will do for her in the future. I believe that Israel is God's timepiece and the Jewish people are God's second hand. If you want to know where we are eschatologically or prophetically in the world today, just keep your eyes on Israel and the Jewish people. I believe that God's prophetic time clock began to tick around May 14th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, stood up on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in Tel Aviv, in Israel's largest city, and announced to the entire world that Israel is now a nation among nations. Immediately, the 6 major Arab countries that surrounded Israel said to Israel, "If you declare yourself to be a nation, we'll drive you into the Mediterranean Sea in 1 week." The following day, on May 15th, 1948, the Jews fought their war of independence against approximately 80 million Arabs with relatively good government, good military hardware, good financing and technology, Russian technology, up against perhaps 650,000 Jews with no government, no military hardware, no financing. Most of them coming out of World War II Nazi Germany, where they lost their entire family members to the death camps and concentration camps of the Holocaust. Now you tell me, who was fighting who? Who was attacking whom? 80 million Arabs against 650,000 Jews. Talk about David and Goliath, they would pale by comparison. I believe that God's prophetic time clock kicked into high gear when in June of 1967, the Jews fought the Six-Day War. And in 6 days, the Jews took from Jordan East Jerusalem. East and West Jerusalem became one under Israeli domination for the first time since 70 AD. And the Roman general Titus and his Roman legions marched into Jerusalem. They destroyed the city. They destroyed the temple and its altar, and they killed approximately 1.1 million Jewish people in a type of Holocaust. The Jews were scattered to the 4 corners of the known world in what became known as the diaspora, only to come out of the diaspora, to make aliyah. Aliyah means to come up to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Today there are over 6.5 million Jewish people living in Israel out of the approximate 14 million Jews in the world, and another 2 million Arabs that are considered to be first-class citizens of Israel. I want to continue with this discussion on the miracle of Israel by looking at the war years of 1935, 36, 37, and Adolf Hitler is making his ascendancy to power in Nazi Germany. And where the Germans are marching, the Jews are getting out. And they're sailing in antiquated pre-World War I type vessels. And they're sailing to Australia. And Australia says, sorry, we have our immigration quotas. We only take so many people from that part of the world, go back to your port of embarkation. So the Jews sail to Canada, hear the same thing. Then they sail to the United States and hear the same thing. And finally the Jews sail across the Mediterranean Sea to Palestine as it was known then. And in 1938, Great Britain, which took this land from the Ottoman Turks who held it for 400 years, came out with the White Papers, which says only 1,500 Jews per month could enter into the land of Israel. I don't like using Palestine. I'm sure you're all aware of it, or Palestinians. It's a contrived word. We're going to talk about it in future lessons. Contrived by Hadrian, but it seems to be the common word. By the way, before 1948, everyone who lived in the land, Jew and Arab, were all called Palestinians. Now, why did Great Britain do this? Why did they establish the White Papers? Were they particularly vindictive? The answer is no. It was 1938, and the writing was on the wall. World War II was about to take place. In Great Britain, one of the Arabs to fight alongside the British against the Germans in World War II. After all, oil was a factor. There was only a handful of Jews. So Great Britain comes out with the White Papers restricting immigration into Israel to only 1,500 Jews per month. This was less than a drop in the ocean in the amount of Jews fleeing for their very lives trying to get into any country that would take them. Now, you might remember Menachem Begin. He was the first and only Orthodox prime minister of Israel. And Menachem formed an underground army called the Irgun, whose purpose was to bring Jews into Palestine, Israel. Great Britain is trying to keep them out. I'm not endorsing Menachem Begin. He did some terrible things. I just want you to understand the context of what I'm talking about. World War II comes along, and the Jews felt that they had a far worse enemy in the British, so the Jews fight alongside the Allies against the Germans in World War II. It's the end of World War II. Most Jews have lost everything. Mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, many times they're the only surviving member in their family. And again, the Jews were setting sail across the Mediterranean Sea to Israel. And in 1947, at the heart of this, Great Britain, with 100,000 men stationed in Israel, an armada of ships stationed there, and the White Paper still in force, as these Jewish vessels get within 3 miles of the land of Israel, Great Britain sends a Navy destroyer out to meet it and send it back to its port of embarkation, or they intern them on the island of Cyprus, where they allow only 1,500 Jews per month to enter in. Until one day a ship comes along called the Exodus, and it's loaded with passengers. Now, you might remember the movie called The Exodus. If not, I suggest you watch it. It stars Paul Newman, who's half Jewish, so don't say there aren't any good-looking Jewish guys out there. We don't all look like Dustin Hoffman, except for me. My wife says, oh yeah, my dreams when I was 21 maybe. But by the way, we were going through the channels, Sue and I, a couple weeks ago, and all of a sudden comes the Exodus. You know, and I was like, where'd this come from? And I had no idea it was almost a 4-hour movie. But watch it. It's a great movie from this time period that I'm talking. I just absolutely cried through the whole thing. It was wonderful. So in the story of the Exodus, the captain of the British destroyer says to the captain of the Exodus, go back. And the captain of the Exodus says, we're not going back. So the captain of the British destroyer says to the captain of the Exodus, then we're going to board you. So the captain of the Exodus says, if you board us, we're going to blow this ship up with men, women, and children. Remember, the whole world is watching this. Their sympathy is with the Jews because they have lost 6 million souls to the Nazis. So the captain of the British destroyer says to the captain of the Exodus, then we're going to stay here until you leave. And the captain of the Exodus responds, not only are we not going to leave, we're not going to eat. And as they were going on a hunger strike, and as they were already half starved, as they died, they simply threw the bodies overboard for the whole world to see. Great Britain goes back to the United Nations and says, you gave us this land in the mandate of 1922. We cannot deal with it. Take it back. We don't care. Do what you want with it. It took Great Britain 6 months to pull out of Israel, and they did so very unevenly, where in every way they could, they favored the Palestinian population, And in every way they could, they harassed the Jewish population. The British would go into the Jewish kibbutzes or farm communities. They'd launch surprise attack. They'd confiscate the Jews' military equipment. And because of the way Great Britain treated the Jews, Great Britain, one of the most powerful countries the world has ever known, it was said of Great Britain, the sun does not set on any part of the British Empire, within 10 years became a third-rate country, economically, politically, religiously, morally, spiritually, in every respect, because there's a principle found in the Bible, and it's found in Genesis 12:3, which says, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. Great Britain had a moral and legal obligation to protect the Jews, but because of political expediency, chose not to do so and went down the tubes. That verse in Genesis 12:3 applies to individuals, nations, churches, everyone. If you want to be blessed by God, bless the Jewish people. And if you want to be cursed, well, you figure it out, right? And by the way, wouldn't you want to be on the side that God is on? And conversely, wouldn't you want to be on the opposite side that the adversary is on? God made an unconditional covenant with the Jews that through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was not based on what they did, but what God has done for them. And because God keeps his promises to the Jews, we can be assured he keeps his promises to us as well. The United Nations comes along and decides it's going to partition half of Israel for a Palestinian state and half for a Jewish state. 80% of Israel has already been given over to Jordan or Transjordan. That left 20% left. The Arabs say, we aren't going to take it. We don't even recognize the Jews' right to exist. The Jews say, better than nothing, we'll take it. But they had, it's not what they expected in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, but they said they would take it. The Jews knew they were about to go to war. They had no military equipment to fight with. Most countries in the world would not sell the Jews military equipment. The ones that would be pre-World War I dilapidated stuff. Israel figures, better than nothing, but they need the money to buy it with. So Israel sends Golda Meir to America in the hopes within a month or two she could collect a sum of $10 or $12 million from Jews and Jewish sympathizers. Golda was born in Russia. She came to America as a young girl, became a U.S. citizen, went to public school in Milwaukee and taught public school in Milwaukee. But as a young woman, she decided to go back to Israel and become part of their political process. So here comes Golda back to New York City. First day she gets off the plane, she collects a sum of $10 or $12 million. And within 2 weeks, she collects $50 million, money the Jews badly needed to buy military equipment. Well, it's one thing to be a nation on paper. It's another thing to be a nation in reality. The Jews needed the recognition of major world powers. And the world power the Jews were concerned with in 1947 was the United States. And the president of the United States in 1947 was the guy that says, give them hell, Harry, and the buck stops here, right? Harry S. Truman. And S stands for what? Nothing, right? Harry was listening to his advisors in State Department and generals that were saying, do not vote for Israel to become a nation. It wasn't that they weren't sympathetic. It would be that Israel would be driven into the Mediterranean Sea. She'd come out stillborn. The U.S. would be making a political and diplomatic blunder. But due to the providence of God, Harry had a business partner in a haberdashery or men's store before he became president, who just happened to be Jewish. And his business partner flies in from Missouri, comes to Washington, D.C., enters into the presence of the President of the United States and says to his old friend Harry, give my people a chance. And Harry said yes. And our country's been blessed in ways we'll never know till we get to heaven for two reasons. Number one, we've given the Jews a homeland like no other country in the world. And number two, we've sent missionaries to the four corners of the world. Great Britain went against her moral and legal obligations to protect the Jews and went down the tubes. The U.S. under Harry Truman, no matter what you think about him, said yes, and we have been blessed. Egypt sends an armada of ships across the Mediterranean Sea ready to level Israel's largest city, Tel Aviv. The Jews have no guns, no planes, no tanks, no bazookas. They have nothing. but they do locate a small Piper Cub plane and two young men. One young man gets in to be the pilot, the other young man gets in to be the bombardier, and with homemade bombs they fly very low over this armada of ships and they drop their bombs. On the last pass they drop the last bomb on the largest ship in the armada, did terrible damage to the ship, and the entire armada of Egyptian ships turns around and goes home. In the process, these two young men flew so low that they died. One of the fathers of these two young men became one of the first speakers of the Israeli Knesset, or Congress, and the other father became one of the first decipherers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wow. Egypt sends a force of 2,500 soldiers across the Suez Canal into the Sinai. It was to be a two-prong attack. One part of the force was to go along the Mediterranean into Tel Aviv and link up with Iraqi and Syrian tanks coming down from the north, and the other part was to go into West Jerusalem and attack the Jews there. This force of 2,500 Egyptians was fully loaded with tanks, half-tracks, Messerschmitt planes, bazookas, and up against them was a force of 150 Jews made up of half farmers and half soldiers with basically little to no military equipment. Somehow this force of 150 Jews stopped this force of 2,500 Egyptians from going any further for 6 months, long enough for the guy with the patch, Moshe Dayan. He used some of the money Golda had got from New York, bought some four-wheel drive Jeeps, loaded some machine guns on those Jeeps, and routed the Egyptians back across the Suez Canal. In the north, Iraqi and Syrian tanks are banding together. Their purpose was to take the Galilee, and after taking the Galilee, they would go into Haifa and effectively cut Israel in half. Well, at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee was a little farm community by Tiberias called Tiganya. And these people in Tiganya, again, had very little military equipment, and they put some barbed wire around their kibbutz, or commune. And as the Iraqi and Syrian tanks came crashing through, the oldest man said, "Keep on fighting on." They had nothing to fight with, but they did have a 16-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl hiding in the underbrush with some Molotov cocktails. The boy jumped on the first tank and destroyed it. That tank is still in Israel today. The girl did terrible damage to the second tank, and the entire attacking force of Iraqi and Syrian tanks turned around and went home. This was as great a miracle as anything in the Old Testament, and it happened in our lifetime. 1 year later, when the armistice was called, Israel actually had more land than they first began. A big surprise, right? I just want to read just a couple pages, if you don't mind, about one particular miracle in the 1948 war. I just found this so cool. Okay? Before I leave the 1948 War of Independence, I wanted to give you another miracle from that time period. During the 1948 war, Ira Rappaport's Israeli platoon fought the Jordanian military for Mount Zion and found themselves surrounded by hundreds with only 25 bullets left. Then, just when the small platoon was about to face the inevitable, something incredible happened. The Jordanian soldiers dropped their weapons and began suddenly running away, screaming, "Father Abraham." Several years later, Ira would come across a familiar face with an unlikely answer as to what had actually occurred on that miraculous day. This was a former Jordanian soldier who had fought against Ira on Mount Zion. According to him, his army all witnessed a vision of Abraham defending the Jews in the sky above the Israeli platoon and had no choice but to drop their weapons and run. And that's not the only appearance of angels and whatever during these wars. That happened numerous times. I mean, I get chills even saying this, and I've done it 100 times, so it's just amazing, you know? Let's move on to the 1967 and the Six-Day War. History books speak of the 100-Year War, the 30-Year War, and many other long-fought battles. Here, in a short 6 days in June of 1967, Israel managed to utterly rout not one but four powerful enemies. Even West Point staff do not teach its cadets about this war. According to military strategy and textbook tactics, The Jews should have lost this war. They should have been swept into the dustbin of history. But you and I know that God protects them even through miracles. The staff at West Point understands that God is winning the Jewish wars, but God does not fit into military textbooks.
Really?
Really.
What a surprise.
There were a multitude of miracles witnessed by the whole world in the miraculous Six-Day War of 1967. The state of Israel was born just 3 years after Auschwitz, but the soul of the state of Israel was born 19 years later in 1967, when East and West Jerusalem became one. In this war, Israel would launch a preemptive strike. Israel does have, and will have a policy of preemptive strike, which means if Israel knew, and in 1967 the entire world knew that Egypt and Syria were about to attack, Israel must strike first. If they don't, they're through. You have to understand that the amount of land given to the nation of Israel by the United Nations in 1947 was smaller in square footage than the state of New Jersey and harder to defend because at one point it was only 9 miles wide. Wow. The Jews say, our bridge is too narrow. If Goliath strikes first, we're through. So Israel sends its planes out to sea in a direction not picked up by Russian radar, came back toward the land of Egypt and Syria, flew very low, dangerously low, under Russian radar, and destroyed 90% of the planes of both Egypt and Syria in the first 5 hours of that war. While this was going on, Nasser of Egypt is telephoning Hussein of Jordan saying, we are defeating the Israelis. We are driving them into the Mediterranean Sea. We are going to toast our victories on the beaches of Tel Aviv. You are either with us or you are against us. He was lying. He was trying to bring Jordan into the battle in order to take the heat off of Egypt. Would you believe the Jews actually intercepted and recorded that telephone conversation? General, I'm not making this up. General Uzi Narkis, the general for the Jews who was head of the Central Theater of Command, was under orders not to fire one round, not one shell against the Jordanians. Because of this telephone call, when Jordan attacked, Israel in the counterattack took from Jordan East Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives, and what you know as the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria. They got that from Jordan. In the south, the Jews took the Sinai from Egypt, more than twice the size of the nation of Israel, but they gave that back years later to Egypt for peace. In the north, the Jews got an area called the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is a mountainous region that runs from about the Sea of Galilee in Israel all the way up to Mount Hermon or Hermon in modern-day Lebanon. It's where the city of refuge was in Old Testament times, and I think the Jews have a ski resort on part of that mountain. And from 1948 to 1967, the Syrians were up there shelling the Israeli farm communities below. The children lived underground, went to school underground, ate underground, came out a couple days a month when there was a lull in the shelling. And from 1948 to 1967, the Syrians were putting in miles and miles of barbed wire and behind it minefields, or miles and miles of barbed wire and minefields and more barbed wire and minefields. It was a Russian technique, 3 strands of deterrent. But do you know the Jews had a secret weapon? His name was Eli Cohen. How many of you ever been to Israel? We asked this earlier here. You should all go visit. I figure if you die there, you'll be closer to heaven, but what do I know? I'm a little biased, so, you know. So if you go to Israel, you'll see Eli Cohen Boulevard. Parents named their children after him, and whole neighborhoods immortalize his character. He was the national hero and master spy of Israel. Eli was a Jew. He was born in Egypt. His mother tongue was Egyptian Arabic. And the Israeli secret Mossad agents, that's like our CIA, took Eli from Egypt and trained him in Israel as a spy. They provided Eli with false documentation and sent him to Argentina, Buenos Aires, as an exporter of fine furniture. Eli lives there for almost 2 years and meets many Syrian businessmen. Then the secret Mossad agents take Eli from Argentina and send him to Damascus, Syria, again with false documentation, And Eli builds this magnificent home. He meets many of the businessmen that he became friends with in Argentina, along with high political figures, and all the generals of the Syrian staff becomes friends with him. Even the daughter of the Syrian president falls madly in love with him. He's a spy for the Jews. At his home, Eli throws some magnificent parties. He has the most powerful radio transmitter known at that time, concealed in his home. By the time the generals have their staff meeting the next day, Eli knows what everything's going on, and he's contacting Israel with that information. One day, Eli becomes very friendly with the chief of staff of the Syrian army. And he says to the chief of staff of the Syrian army, "Take me to the Golan Heights." Well, they do. And in front of the generals, he takes out his drawing pads and he sketches in where the minefields are, the tanks are, the troops are, the pillboxes are. He sketches in it all over the place. Then he hollows out the leg of a chair, puts the drawings in, sends the table and chair to Argentina, Buenos Aires, and by the time the war breaks out, the Jews know where everything is because of Eli Cohen. One day Eli says to his friend, the chief of staff of the Syrian army, "The Jews aren't dummies. Before they attack, they'll send their observation planes over, and they'll see where your tanks are, your troops are, and your pillboxes are. Plus, it gets very hot up here. Do one thing that will help you two ways. Plant this particular type of tree. It'll give your men shade, and it will hide your military installations from the Israelis." Well, Syria does it. So Eli simply wires Israel and says, when you see this particular type of tree, shell the tree. There's a Syrian pillbox right next to it. Happened, you know. In 1965, with Eli still living in Damascus, Syria, and his wife and children living in Tel Aviv in Israel, he's trying to contact his wife and children using this powerful radio transmitter. The Indian government in Syria is trying to contact their government in India, run into interference. They hone in on Eli's signal from 3 different directions. Syria already knows there's a spy, I guess you call it a mole, somewhere in their government. They capture Eli. Israel says, "Give us back Eli Cohen. We'll empty out our prisons. 600 or so Syrian prisoners can leave. Give us back Eli Cohen." And Syria said no. And they hung him upside down in Damascus, Syria, for ridicule and shame. So Israel says, "Give us back Eli's body. We'll give you $15 million in farm equipment for his body." Syria said no. They buried him in an unmarked grave somewhere in Syria. They've dug him up and buried him so many times so that nobody knows where he's at. Eli was the unsung hero and master spy of the 1967 Six-Day War. And there's a great movie out about Eli Cohen's life, and it's called The Impossible Spy. The Impossible Spy. After Israel conquered the Golan Heights from Syria in the Six-Day War, the world comes to Israel and says, "Give it back." Israel says, "You got to be out of your tree. It's a natural defensible border. We've lost thousands of men. Other countries win land in battle. They don't give it back. It can't be one law for Israel and one law for the rest of the world." The answer is no. Then the world comes to Israel and says, "Give us back the West Bank, Judea and Samaria." Israel says the Arabs can live there. They can have their own police, their own mayors. They can have their own schools. And they can even be autonomous, but it has to be part of a Jewish outpost, because if we simply turn the West Bank over to the Palestinians, the PLO, or Palestine Liberation Organization, will be up against our border within 6 months and put us into an impossible to defend position. So the answer is no. In 1973, Israel would fight the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year for Jewish people. It's the highest of the high holidays, and it was on a cold day in October of 1973. There were over 200 separate communiques from Israeli secret Mossad agents from around the world saying, "The Arabs are coming. The Arabs are coming." They knew the place, the time, the date. They knew it all. However, the Israeli government, so puffed up with pride because of their victory in 1967, and so worried about world public opinion, said, "No, well, it'll never happen. We'll pulverize them." The government was led by Golda Meir as prime minister and Moshe Dayan as chief of staff. By the way, it cost Golda her job. So here comes Egypt, crossing the Bar-Lev line from the south with 2,500 tanks. The Bar-Lev line was named after an Israeli general and thought to be impregnable. The Egyptian army overran the Bar-Lev line in less than 2 hours due to the element of overwhelming firepower and surprise. In the north, along the Golan Heights, Syria is coming with 1,800 tanks. There are less than 600 IDF Jews guarding the border with Syria. The Jews were literally throwing their bodies in front of these tanks to give the Jews time to come out of their temples, synagogues, and shul. Remember, this was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, and the Jewish people are in their synagogues worshiping God. Israel has a small standing army of 650,000 men and women, but they can mobilize 2 million, but it takes them 2 days to do so. Now, before this war began, both Egypt and Syria were putting in SAM 6 and 7 missile sites, and the Jews were bombing them every day. You might remember, if you're old enough, the news back then. Henry Kissinger was telling the Jews, quit bombing these sites. Henry said, they don't mean you any harm. We're trying to build good relations with the Russians. Quit doing it. So the Jews do quit doing it. So in October of 1973, when the Jews tried to use their trump card and send their planes up in the air, they would simply be knocked out of the sky by the SAM 6 and 7 missiles. So here comes Egypt crossing their border with Israel with 2,500 tanks, and for 2 days they kept moving. They simply kept moving. Here comes Syria crossing the Golan Heights in the north with 1,800 tanks, and for 2 days they kept moving. They simply kept moving. But after 2 days they stopped. They simply stopped. It's a Russian policy. You move your supplies, you move your tanks, and after 2 days you stop, you regroup, resupply, bring in reinforcements. Plus, they thought the Jews were trying to set a trap from them from behind. If they would have kept going for 2 more days, they would have destroyed all of Israel, but due to the providence of God, they simply stopped. Things were going so badly for Israel in the first 2 days of that war that Moshe Dayan comes to Golda Meir with the code words, the third temple is about to be destroyed. It was the code words to arm their nuclear bombs. It's what's called the Samson option. The Samson option is the name given to Israel's deterrent strategy of massive retaliation with nuclear weapons as a last resort against a country or countries whose military has destroyed much of Israel. The name is a reference to the biblical Israelite judge Samson, who pushed apart the pillars of a Philistine temple, bringing down the roof and killing himself and thousands of Philistines who were captured with him. So Israel took about 13 nuclear bombs, armed them, put them on various planes, and set them to 4 or 5 various airfields around Israel in case worse came to worse. Now, just want to take a few minutes if I can. I don't want to run too long here. Are we okay? No. I'm not boring anybody yet, right?
Oh, no.
Okay, all right. All right, before I go on, I want to spend a little time explaining how Richard M. Nixon saved Israel.
Excuse me.
Milhouse. After 3 a.m. on Saturday, October 6, 1973, White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig woke up President Nixon at his home in California with the news that Egypt and Syria had attacked Israel. The Israeli state faced the greatest threat to their survival since the original War of Independence 3 decades earlier. It is one of history's greatest ironies that Nixon played an integral role in the salvation of the Jewish state. Since the release of the Watergate tapes, it has become an established fact that of the Nixon years that the president was a raving anti-Semite. Nixon was heard saying on recorded tapes that the Jews needed to be controlled by placing someone at the top who is not Jewish. He also said that most Jews are disloyal, and generally speaking, you can't trust them, they turn on you. This is incredible given the position he took to help the Jewish state later on. Yet, as I said, Nixon would play a pivotal role in the protecting Israel. You know, God was using Nixon to accomplish his purposes. You don't want me to say what I'm thinking. You're all probably thinking the same thing about right now, right?
Exactly.
As a young boy, Richard's Christian Quaker mother told him that one day he would be in a powerful position and a situation would arise where Israel and the Jews needed his help. When it did, he was to be there and help them. It was reported that Nixon said he heard the voice of his mother saying these words to him when he responded to a call and plea for help from Golda at 3 o'clock in the morning. Golda was known for her iron will, but when she called Nixon, she was totally desperate and begged for his help. She even contemplated suicide and had a pill ready in case worse came to worse. So when Golda picked up the phone and called President Nixon and asked for help, Nixon heard the prophetic words and the voice of his mother as he listened to Golda's plea. By the time she hung up, Golda Meir had the weapons help the country needed that swung the pendulum to Israel's favor to bring an end to the Yom Kippur War. To this day, Richard Nixon is highly regarded in Israel, as is Harry Truman. Prime Minister Golda Meir and Nixon kept in frequent touch throughout the ordeal. For the rest of Golda's life, she referred to Nixon as my president and said, for generations to come, all will be told of the miracle of the planes for the United States bringing in the material that meant life to our people. Going back to where I started before Nixon, so just 2 days into the war, Russian spy satellite sees what Israel's doing by arming their nuclear bombs. Russia is putting paratroopers on the planes coming into the Middle East, along with sending ships armed with nuclear bombs coming towards Syria. Next, the United States see what Russia is doing. They're calling a code red, unlocking our ICBM units, and the world is about to go to World War III. Now, with all this buildup, guess what happens next? General Ariel Sharon for Israel, who at the time was the number 2 man in the Israeli command, was a field general. And without orders from above, that's why people didn't like him, he takes his tanks and goes after the Egyptian Third Army, consisting of 40,000 men. This was one of the largest tank battles in all of history. The Egyptians thought Sharon would engage them in pitched battle. Instead, Sharon does a surprise maneuver, opens up a corridor 10 miles wide in the Egyptian Third Army. He surrounds the Egyptian Third Army. The Egyptians, running out of food, water, and supplies, simply give up. Ariel knocks out the SAM 6 and 7 missile sites, and he's 2 days away from destroying Cairo, Egypt. In the north of Israel, there's a young lieutenant named Steve Greengold, who is a commander in the Israeli Tank Corps. Steve hears that war broke out, and he's 5 miles away from the front lines. Now, in Israel, you can be 5 miles away from the front lines. He's in civilian clothes. He hitchhikes to the front lines. He asks his commanding officer for a command. They give him his tank and 3 others. They get up along the Golan Heights. It's all sand dune and mountainous. Immediately, 2 tanks get knocked out. His tank and another back down along the base of the Golan Heights, found a narrow ravine thought impossible to climb, did it, started hitting, running, and shooting, hitting, running, and shooting. At one point, his tank got knocked out. He got badly burned on the hands and face. He commandeers a passing Israeli tank. He continues hitting, running, and shooting. After 2 days, he fell down before his commanding officer and said, "I can do no more." They documented he knocked out 60 Syrian tanks. A greater miracle as anything ever. It gave the Jews time to come out of their temples, synagogues, and shuls, time to knock out the SAM 6 and 7 missile sites, and they're 2 days away from destroying Damascus, Syria. Wow. Now, when Israel is losing, guess what the world said? Nada, nothing. But when Israel's winning, guess what the world said? Ceasefire, ceasefire. Israel did cease fire, not because the United Nations said so, because the U.S. said so. They knew that they didn't, that Russia, that had billions of dollars invested in the Middle East, was coming into that war. Israel today is surrounded on all sides by enemy countries bent on their destruction. The Oslo Accords, which gave away land for peace, did not work. You might remember pre-World War II and the declaration made by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain concerning the Munich Agreement, offering peace for our time or land for peace. That did not work either. Besides, God is not happy when you give away His land. Peace will not come to the Middle East, to the Prince of Peace, Shar Shalom, Jesus Christ, comes back at His second advent or second coming. I want you to know I don't agree with everything that Israel does, but they have a right to live in safe and secure borders as every other country in the world. How would you feel if we had terrorists coming in from Canada, coming after our citizens? We'd say, get our Marines up there and knock them out. It can't be one law for Israel and one law for the rest of the world. In closing, let me say every step of Israel's preservation, return, and success could easily have failed, and in fact should have failed. Everything about Israel has been a miracle from the beginning to the end. I believe if Israel's enemies would just watch some of the old newsreels from the 48, 57, 67, and 73-day war, they would save themselves a whole lot of trouble from trying to attack Israel. It seems to me that every time they attack Israel, the Jews end up with more land. Always remember the Jews are blessed with 2 iron domes. One is used to intercept incoming missiles, and the other is even more powerful, and his name is Yeshua. Thank you. So hopefully the audience will stay tuned for the last 3 lessons that are being videotaped. We're going to go into Israel's past, we're going to go into Israel's present, and we're going to go into Israel's future. So what I told you just now is just a tiny portion of the miracles of Israel. By the way, I turned 70 April 4th, and it was about 5 weeks or so before the nation of Israel was born. So I think about that as I turn a certain age, that Israel's, Yeah. Oh, about 5 minutes. Yeah, I'm sorry if I took a lot of time. I apologize, but all right. So, all right. Question. All right. Oh God, trust me, not on me. Right? Believe me on that one. Go ahead. Yeah.
I read somewhere that people were complaining that Netanyahu is not giving room for the diaspora. How do you pronounce it?
Not get what?
He's disrespecting the Jews who are scattered still. That he
In the diaspora? Well, I've not heard that. I can't imagine him doing that. Someone knows more about it than I do, but but you never know.
And you said something about the Orthodox, and today they were saying that Jared Kushner is an Orthodox.
Yeah, from as little as I know, I believe he is, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
I didn't get a chance to follow the news. I knew there was going to be riots today. I mean, it was obvious. They've been building up to it for weeks. But what's going on over there is just unbelievable. Hamas using little children as a shield. I mean, and then all this horrible Israel. Oh, they're so terrible. Look what they're doing to our people. They've kicked us out. The Arabs were not kicked out when the Jews came in. The Jews told the Arabs, stay, don't leave. Become part of our country. Become first-class citizens. But the Arabs left. They went into the West Bank. And the Gaza Strip and the countries around them said, let them go, let them do it. Look what these terrible Jews are doing to these poor people. And the Arabs are still, from what I guess, citizens of Jordan. Why didn't Jordan take it? Why don't they take them back? Why didn't Saudi Arabia, that was given billions of dollars to the enemies of the Jews, why didn't they take the Palestinians in? And so the world buys what Arafat says, that the Jews are the most horrible people, they're apartheid, whatever. It's nonsense, Was it Goebbels or something in Nazi Germany? He was that propaganda minister that said, if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, goodness gracious, even Christians are taken in by this stuff. There's no excuse for that. There really isn't. And what an exciting time to be alive. I'm a pre-trib. I believe the rapture's coming, and my goodness, You know, there's no signs for the rapture. There's all kinds of signs for the tribulation, and they are sure heating up right now. And I just can't wait. I just can't wait to meet Christ in the air, and I just think it's happening so soon. You know, a little of it's because I turned 70 and my body's starting to fall apart. But I have to be honest, but also because I want to be with my blessed hope, and